ENUK. A chilling silence, broken only by winter's icy breath, settled on the harsh borders of Sparta. The guards of Clesia, a border fortress whose eyes were trained to spot threats miles away, discerned only snow-covered expanses and an eerie quiet. However, what approached from the Boeotian hills was not an army, but an entire social movement, led by the genius of Epaminondas. Following him was not just a military force, but living history, some 70,000 allied warriors, thousands of freed helots carrying tools, children, and the hope of a new life. These were peasants, builders, exiles, returning to lands taken from them generations ago. This was not a conquest, but a rebirth. Even before the first stone was cast, a psychological war had begun. As the endless columns snaked along the mountain paths, Epaminondas gave his command. The army would play not martial marches, but the forbidden hymns of Messenia, melodies that had been strictly prohibited on Spartan soil for over 3 centuries. The sounds echoed through the hills, reaching hidden helot settlements like a divine revelation. Men and women could not hold back their tears, hearing freedom find its voice for the first time in their lives. When the column reached the impregnable Clesia, the garrison commander faced a dilemma not covered by Spartan law: to resist and perish ingloriously, or to retreat, covering himself in eternal shame. He chose life. And thus, for the first time since the Persian Wars, foreign troops entered Spartan territory without a single shot being fired. However, Epaminondas was not in a hurry to march on Sparta itself. Instead, he directed his assault against its most vulnerable point, the soul of the Spartan people. Helot barracks were set ablaze, Cryptea watchtowers were demolished, and slave pens were destroyed. Each freed slave became a hammer, shattering the Spartan myth. The sacred band, once a terror to its enemies, now planted olive trees where young Spartans were forced to kill to survive. They erected monuments at sites of mass Helot exterminations, carried out to maintain control over the population. Every act of creation was an act of rebellion. As the army approached Sparta, setting temples alight, making camp in sacred groves, and freeing slaves before the astonished agora, the message was abundantly clear: Sparta had lost its significance. And for the first time in centuries, the city of warriors took no action. From the summit of Mount Ithome, a panorama of lands long deprived of freedom unfolded. Yet now, by Epaminondas's will, these lands were to be transformed, to acquire a rebellious spirit. Messenia was to be reborn, not as a Spartan outpost or a camp for the enslaved, but as a free city, built by the hands of those who once wore shackles. Thousands of former helots toiled day and night, working tirelessly to outpace the relentless march of time. Everyone understood that the Spartans would not delay, and by their arrival, the new city had to stand as an impregnable fortress. The sacred band led this grand endeavor. Warriors who had crushed enemy phalanxes with the might of spear and shield now, with the same fierce zeal, hoisted heavy stones and timbers. They were not merely building walls, they were forging history. Cleander and Theron labored shoulder to shoulder, bearing an immense burden. When Cleander strained his back attempting to set a cornerstone, Theron carried a double load for an entire week, demonstrating his devotion to their shared cause. Their love, once forged in battle, was now embodied in robust fortifications. Messenia grew at a phenomenal rate, like a clap of thunder. Its walls reached 40 feet in height and were so broad that 4 men could walk abreast upon them. However, its true grandeur lay not in architectural magnificence, but in its very idea, democracy. It was the first Greek city founded exclusively by former slaves. The Spartans, of course, were not long in arriving. But instead of a disorganized rabble and a broken people, they were met by an impregnable fortress city, well armed, organized, and ready for defense. A prolonged siege began. On one side stood the Spartan army, small in number, embittered, disciplined, and desperately trying to reclaim lands they had held for centuries. On the other side, the sacred band stood shoulder to shoulder with former helots, who now, as free men, defended not only the walls but also their human dignity. This was not merely a military confrontation, it was a clash of 2 civilizations. Within the city walls, people fought for the future of their children, whilst outside, soldiers defended a past that was irrevocably gone. The siege lasted for 6 long months, but Sparta was no longer the same. Its power was waning, and the fear it once inspired no longer gripped people's hearts. When the Spartans finally retreated, leaving Messene unconquered and unyielding, the defeat was marked not by the lowering of banners or mountains of corpses, but by an ominous silence. For the first time in history, Sparta proved unable to reclaim what it considered its rightful property. The world watched, and realized that the era of fear had come to an end. The hour of reckoning had arrived. Theban forces surged toward Sparta itself, not with catapults or fire, but by their sheer presence alone. Epaminondas and his sacred band camped within sight of the city walls for 3 days, their bronze armor reflecting the sun's rays like mirrors, their banners proudly fluttering in the winter wind. They made no attempt to attack, for there was no need. The Spartans, descendants of those who once defied entire empires, were now locked behind their walls. For 3 centuries, they had asserted that they needed no fortifications, that the valor of Spartan warriors was sufficient for defense. But now they hid behind stones, like cowardly hares. Foreign soldiers feasted in sacred groves, helots gained freedom before everyone's eyes, temples burned, and fields were cursed. Yet not a single Spartan dared to confront the enemy. This was not a battle, but a message etched into the tablets of Greek history. Sparta no longer instilled fear, it existed only in myths. And that myth had been dispelled. On the 4th morning, Epaminondas gave his final order, not to attack, not to conquer, but to leave. To depart from Messenia, towards restoration and the future. The meaning of this decision was clear: Sparta was not worth conquering, it had lost its significance, its time was over. An empire built on fear, silence, and slavery was crushed not by a vast army or siege engines, but by 300 warriors fighting for love, and a general who understood that history is written not only in blood but also in dignity. The sacred band stood atop the hill, watching the army turn west. They cast a final glance at the city that once ruled the Greek world and saw only stones and memories. They had come to end an empire, but also to prove something greater: the future belongs not to domination, but to liberation. And they walked towards that future together. The founding of Messene in 369 BC was an event unprecedented in Greek history. It was not a conquest or a colonization, but a resurrection. On the very land where helots were once brutally tortured, starved, and murdered, majestic towers and homes now rose. Olive trees were planted where boys had been forced to kill. The sacred band, warriors who once terrified the entire Aegean, now toiled side by side with freed slaves, laying stones, raising beams, and building hope. Every brick in Messene's wall was an act of defiance, a city where the oppressed governed themselves. A democracy built by those once deemed unworthy even of being called human. And the Spartans watched, helpless. Each sunrise brought them new humiliation: smoke from the forges where slaves crafted weapons for their defense, banners flying from towers where chains once hung. This was a revolution they could not stop, for this time it was not coming to them, it had already passed them by. Ultimately, Sparta, driven by a thirst for revenge and years of humiliation, unleashed its full might upon Messene. However, instead of the expected ashes, the Spartans were met by an impregnable fortress, imbued with a spirit of unity, resilience, and common purpose. Within these walls, warriors of the sacred band and freed slaves stood shoulder to shoulder, united not by a desire for conquest or vengeance, but by mutual support and the right to a dignified existence. The 6-month siege revealed that Sparta had lost its former greatness. Its army had become a pale shadow of its former self, tactics without inspiration, tradition without fire. The Spartans, stripped of their former glory, retreated, broken not by spears, but by the unyielding will of Messene's defenders. It became clear that Sparta had lost its capacity for conquest, its might had become an empty spectacle, and its legend a fiction. The sacred band, against all expectations, had not merely endured, but had surpassed Sparta. In 362 BC, a messenger arrived in Thebes, bearing news simultaneously stained with blood and wreathed in glory. Gasping, he proclaimed in the city's agora, "We have won. The Spartan-Athenian alliance is crushed, their armies scattered, and their generals either dead or fled." However, then came words that overshadowed the jubilation: Epaminondas has fallen. On the battlefield of Mantinea, the brilliant strategist Epaminondas had achieved a decisive victory, employing his innovative oblique order. Enemy ranks crumbled under the onslaught of his army, but Epaminondas, a true leader, was at the forefront. He fearlessly plunged into the thick of battle, a philosopher with a sword in his hand. At the climax of the fight, an enemy spear pierced his chest. As he fell to the ground, the sacred band warriors, consumed by fury, fought their way to their general. Pelopidas, his old friend, knelt over him, clutching the bloodied armor. "We have won," he whispered. Epaminondas, gazing at the heavens, replied, "No, my friend, we have lost." He foresaw that without unity, Greece would descend into chaos and internecine strife. With his last breath, the hope for a brighter future also faded. The prophecy came true with unexpected speed. After Epaminondas's death, the fragile alliance disintegrated, city-states became mired in egoism, and Thebes lost its influence. Into the vacuum burst Philip II of Macedon, well known to the sacred band. In his youth, he had been a hostage in Thebes, where he meticulously observed the sacred band's training, memorizing formations and tactical methods. Pelopidas once remarked, "He learns too quickly and smiles like a man plotting mischief." Now, that smile became the symbol of a ruthless conquering machine. Philip refined Epaminondas's tactics, elevating them to a level of cold, professional brutality. His soldiers fought not out of love for their homeland, but for pay, for conquest, and for the creation of an empire. The sacred band was about to confront this new world, but they were no longer revolutionaries, merely a relic of a fading era. They were destined to fight their last battle. On the sweltering day of August 2, 338 BC, as the plain of Chaeronea was bathed in an ominous light, a tragic drama unfolded, predetermining the fate of ancient Greece. Two forces converged on the battlefield. On one side, approximately 35,000 Greek warriors, including Athenians and Thebans, desperately fighting to preserve their independence. On the other, Philip II battle-hardened Macedonian army, numbering 24,000, whose discipline and relentlessness were legendary. The Macedonian left flank was commanded by a young, yet already renowned general, 18-year-old Alexander, Philip's son. At the epicenter of the confrontation, on the Greek coalition's right flank, stood the sacred band, 300 warriors whose gray hairs and scars spoke of rich combat experience. Cleander and Theron, inseparable in love and war for 3 decades, stood shoulder to shoulder. Words were superfluous, for they both understood the tragic nature of the moment. The battle began with the deafening roar of armies clashing. The Greeks, with desperate fury, crashed against the Macedonians, but their onslaught was insufficient to break Philip's well-oiled war machine. Alexander, like a hurricane, swept through the Athenian left flank, clearing everything in his path. Meanwhile, the sacred band, true to its principles, tore a breach in the Macedonian right flank, fighting not for glory, but for their comrades in arms. When Theron was wounded in the shoulder by a Sarissa, Cleander, maddened by grief, surged forward to protect his beloved, sacrificing tactical order and enemy lives. Around them, other members of the band performed similar feats of self-sacrifice. However, this time the situation was different. The Macedonians did not retreat. For every fallen enemy warrior, 2 new ones appeared. Philip's army was an unstoppable force. The sacred band found itself surrounded, with no possibility of retreat or surrender. The warriors locked their shields, forming a circle on a small hill, ready to meet death as they had lived life, together. One by one they fell, without fear or shame, but remaining loyal to their ideals until the very end. As the sun dipped below the horizon, 300 bodies lay on the battlefield, arranged in perfect battle formation. Their spears were still pointed towards the enemy, and their hands clutched the bodies of their fallen comrades. Philip, deeply moved by what he saw, walked among the dead, and tears welled in his eyes. "Cursed be anyone who doubts the honor of these warriors," he uttered. In tribute to their courage and love, he ordered a monument to be erected, not in honor of his victory, but in memory of the sacred band's heroism. A marble lion, a symbol of eternal remembrance, was placed at the site of their last stand, a reminder that love and devotion can withstand any force, be it bronze, empires, or time itself.